the Emperor. Is the Emperor the most vilified card in the tarot? Yeah, and that's probably deserved. Looking back through history's long lens, all of the wars, all of the genocides, all of the battles have been thanks to kings, presidents, emperors. And so it's easy to see why this card has sort of earned the ire of every tarot reader who cares about the world or has experienced the traumas inflicted on them by emperor types. If the Fool has become the avatar for everything good about tarot, the Emperor kind of becomes the avatar for everything bad about it. When the creator of the Japaridza tarot made that card, they changed the card's name to War. So that tells you just about everything they think about that character, don't they? And we're still suffering the consequences of those emperors and kings. We're still dealing with war, strife, colonialism, genocide, nationalism. We're still being held in the grips of these toxic identities, these toxic ideas by toxic men who just happen to bully their way to the front of the table. Add to that everyone's innate daddy issues, and we've got a pretty complicated card with a lot of pretty complicated reactions to it. Well, maybe not everyone's. And the Emperor does contain those things. That's hard to deny. You really can't take that away from it. But we need cards to do more than just one thing. We need them to represent life. So the point is, if we need a card to represent toxic masculinity...
Okay, that is blush in a gun.
Patriarchy, institutions that are male-centered and dominant, or cruel, or warlike, or belligerent, all of those bad qualities about the king. We've got a pretty handy card that sums it up pretty well. But again, what can the card do beyond that? Because context always matters. There are readers who might say you would never get the Emperor in a reading where you needed a positive answer if all your associations for the cards were negative. But I have found that just not to be true in life, and so we need realistic, real-life understandings of the cards and all their nuances. Today we're going to do that with the Emperor, and I think you'll find that even if there are not gushingly positive interpretations for the cards, there are ways in which that card can behave positively or neutrally depending on the situation. Now, let's get something out of the way. I don't read with astrology. It just doesn't make sense to me, and I think it's too complicated a topic to try to boil down into sort of a bastardized version of it that tarot kind of uses, maybe-ish. But I always remember the astrological association for the Emperor. It's Aries, the god of war. And I remember that because there's some fucking scary Aries out there in the world. Scary Aries. It's going to be the name of my band. And you can see all of that in the card. It's interesting to think about how the Golden Dawn and its precursors sort of knew what patriarchy and colonialization looked like because they put it all in that card. And Pamela Colman Smith certainly served it for lunch. It's fascinating to think that even then, when the empire was still so powerful, they kind of understood how fucked up it was. You know, live and learn. But again, context. Say we're doing a reading for how to achieve something, a promotion maybe, or success in a career. If we draw the Emperor, does that mean the best way to get ahead and work is to come in and club everyone over the head, being belligerent and a total toxic asshole? Well, that's worked for a lot of men over history, but probably not the best idea today. So how do we recontextualize that card in the context of something that's reasonable and appropriate for someone seeking to advance their career? What are qualities that you can find in the Emperor that would offer advice in that situation? One thing that I learned from Camilla Elias is the idea of function. To think about the function of an entity or an item in interpreting so that you have a deeper sense of the thing beyond what you've been told. Now, I interpret things differently than she does, but I take the idea and run with it. And I think the idea of function in reading is fundamentally one of the most helpful things you can work with when you're interpreting cards. Just to go back to the essence of it and say, what is the function of this thing? Not what is my cultural understanding of it, not even what is the historical reality of it, but what is the fundamental function of the thing? What is it for? And you can do this in a neutral way, or you could think in its most ideal way, what would this thing be for? And we can do that with everything, even the cards we think are the most fucked up. I keep saying that today. Fucked up, fucked up. Anyway, what is the purpose of an Emperor? Divorcing it from all of our biased associations with it. Yes, biased. Is the bias accurate? Yes. But of course, in this situation, we're trying to be a little more balanced. So if we strip away all that cultural baggage, which again is very valid, we're going to find that an emperor is a leader, an emperor is a strategizer, an emperor is the head of state, the emperor runs the show. So these are all more neutral qualities, more neutral functions of the job of the emperor that aren't colored by the way that emperors have traditionally taken advantage of those qualities throughout their lives and history. It's all of the things that you think about with leadership kind of boil down into an iconic image that has all this cultural baggage with it. And I keep using the term cultural baggage because there's an idea in sort of literary criticism that there's the thing and then there's the culture thing. Like the book Oliver Twist exists as a thing, its own self, its own book, its own story that Dickens wrote, but it also exists in the cultural mind, the way that people remember it, think about it, the way it's used in pop culture. And that often really shifts the perception of the item. It shifts the perception of the book or the song or whatever. And so we kind of forget what the real thing is, and what we remember is the culture thing. We remember the culture text of Oliver Twist, which in Oliver Twist's case is probably a little better for Dickens because the book is actually really anti-Semitic. But the idea with the emperor is similar. We sort of get into a culture lens with the card because we've been taught certain things about it, and we also have our own personal experience of men like the emperor that we kind of project on the card. And also things that have to do with the idea of power, right? So in the emperor is all our stereotypes about power, which makes sense because historically, and I keep saying this, people with power abuse it. But the function of the emperor is not to abuse power, theoretically. The function of the emperor is to lead, to tax, to create diplomacy. A lot like the empress. And one thing we talked about with the empress was how the empress has to do the job of the emperor with obstacles that the emperor doesn't have. We can get into the psychology of that too. The emperor doesn't have those same constraints, but that doesn't mean his perception is the same. When you hear, for example, people whining about privilege and that, well, I didn't have an easy life. I'm not privileged. They don't get the idea of there are degrees of privilege, there are degrees of experience. And so the emperor probably thinks that he has it really tough, even though the world was literally designed to make him feel good about himself, that he was ordained by God to do that job, right? So then there's this whole sort of sense of entitlement in the card too, which is part of the culture text of the emperor thinking about all those problematic things with power, but it's not a quality we typically associate with the card, that sense of entitlement. But another thing about the emperor too is that they do believe they are doing the thing they were meant to do. And that's a really powerful thing if we divorce it from the sort of monarchy and the idea of like deities proclaiming particular people to be the rulers of the world. Knowing or feeling very strongly that you're doing what you meant to be doing is something that's really helpful, especially if we're talking about doing a reading about advancing in your career. The first thing you really want to do is know that it's the thing you're meant to do. If you're not meant to do it, you're probably not going to engage in it as fully as you should to get where you want to go, right? So like within these little sort of fucked upnesses of our understanding of these cards, we can still tease out more neutral ways of looking at the thing. Do you know what I mean? I know that this seems somewhat far-fetched, but where I think people get stuck when they're learning tarot or they get stuck in a reading is that they come up against a card like the Emperor and the culture text of it, what we understand of it, doesn't make sense contextually. What I'm trying to get you to do, even in this sort of somewhat far-fetched way, is to unpack the card. You don't have to do this like in a journal. You can sit with the card in a reading and say, okay, I understand that the card represents entitlement. I understand that the card represents power and belligerence and war and even patriarchy. What is the function, though, of an emperor? What are qualities that an emperor exhibits that might be useful advice for me in this situation? As I keep saying, it doesn't really matter what I'm telling you the card represents because I may never have a reading where that comes up. And you may never have a reading where that comes up. The idea of this whole series is not so much to tell you what the cards mean, because I don't really believe in that. It's to show you how I take the card apart in the moment and in context to unlock it. and to understand it in ways that are different than we were told they mean, that make more contextual sense rather than culture sense, if that makes sense. Good. I mean, ultimately, even the greatest despots probably had someone who loved them somewhere along the line. Or maybe they didn't, and that's why they became despots. I don't know. But the point is, they probably had a mother who loved them, or something, or a nanny, or a pet. Somewhere along the line, someone was nice to that character, and they experienced, a good moment. And that may have changed them for the good. I don't know. Stop it. Even if we're doing a reading about a conflict, like a fight, the impulse might immediately be to say, well, the emperor represents going in there and bashing their face in, right? But, that is not how most conflicts get resolved. It almost always requires some amount of strategy and diplomacy in order to achieve a peaceful result to something. Fighting and belligerence just leads to more fighting and belligerence. People don't win a war because they just one day realize, oh, okay, we figured it out. People win a war because the other side gets tired and worn out. So yes, you could achieve an end to a conflict by just tiring out your partner, or you could think about qualities of the emperor that might suit you. Strategy, diplomacy. I think of the emperor as probably a really good chess player because it requires a certain amount of strategy to achieve that. And even if we think of that card in the Japaridza Tarot renamed War, war is a pretty hard thing to neutralize as a concept in a reading. But what is required in order to win a war? Certainly strategy, certainly an understanding of the other side, certainly an understanding of how battles get won. So there is an intelligence required. I'm being generous, but do you get what I mean? In order to achieve an end to something, in order to win a war, you have to figure out how to do it. And the winners of wars have done that better than the other side. But what if the question is, should I go on a date with this person? That's a tricky one too, right? How do you know? This is a perfect example of why I don't read with only one card, because I just need more context. If the card is surrounded by wands and swords, these weapons, if the card is surrounded by kings and knights, the bros in battle, that's probably someone that I would want to stay away from. It seems like they might have some toxic masculinity issues going on, given all of that sort of stereotypical maleness and weaponry in the reading. Also, the fact that wands are associated with sex could tell you something weird about the card. On the other hand, if the card is surrounded by cups and coins, by influences like queens or empresses or the lovers or even temperance, you might have a different situation that you might have someone who sort of recognizes their privilege and power, but who is more balanced and nuanced in their approach, who maybe is an anti-patriarchal patriarch. Do you know what I mean? As always, it's all in the context, it's all in the details, it's all in what the cards are surrounded by. So where the emperor shows up in a spread, who they're surrounded by, what they're surrounded by, all of these things can color your interpretation and give you more of a sense of how this emperor is behaving. Are they that classic belligerent world beater, or are they a more thoughtful, nuanced, hermitish, wise sort of hero? We're all in need of a hero, and he's got to be big, and he's got to be strong, and he's got to be larger than life. As always, these are big generalities, so I'm not saying it's always going to be this, sort of easy or even nuanced. Sometimes cards just are what they are. But again, I want you to not feel stuck, and I want you to feel open to the possibility of the card, not hemmed in by rigid interpretations that may or may not be helpful depending on the situation. This is what I mean when I say the cards don't really mean anything. They're kind of inert tools that float in nothingness. That's maybe a little more meta than I meant to make it. But that they're just pieces of paper until they come into context with you, with a question, with a querent, and with each other. And when you are open to it, they do start to dance together. And you start to find things that are maybe more complex, more detailed, more interesting than what you can get out of a book. Or, it's not that there's anything wrong with the books. The books are great. The books are where we start. But the books aren't where you're going, they're where you're coming from. And what I want to show you as a teacher is sort of how to get where you want to be rather than stay where you are. So like I said, these videos are probably going to get a little shorter, in part because we're moving out of the characters into concepts and ideas, but also because the challenge for you is really to keep doing this yourself, to take the card in different contexts and understand its function, understand why it's doing what it's doing, understands what qualities are most appropriate or most activated in a reading given what you know about the card or the title or the function, etc. So tell me about the Emperor. Where do you see the Emperor beyond that sort of toxic masculinity character that we all know and hate? What does the Emperor have that's more nuanced? How can the Emperor serve a reading in a different way? How can it be good advice? And where are the times that it's just what it looks like? It's just sort of being belligerent. It's just kind of being a pain in the ass. It's just being a scary Aries. Looking forward to hearing from you and your thoughts. By the way, I am reading all the comments. My emotional energy is rather laggy sometimes, so it's hard for me to respond to everything, but I really appreciate everyone who's liking the series and letting me know about it. It means a lot. Please keep doing that. It's really encouraging to know that people are responding to this and that you're getting something out of it. But I read all of them, and I really appreciate your engagement. So next week, we're going to do the last of the people in the majors. We're going to talk about the Hierophant. Similar to this card, too, I think is villainized and fairly, but there are ways of looking at it with some nuance. Think about how. Start thinking about that now. Don't wait till I tell you what it is. Go do it. We'll talk soon. Be good. Take care.